Hello and welcome to Daily Debrief, your primer on international news brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika and today we'll be talking about the latest from Afghanistan, a referendum in New Caledonia, and the future of a vote on housing in Berlin. Now, our first story is from Afghanistan, where the UN Security Council has adopted a resolution to facilitate humanitarian aid to the country. The resolution was proposed by the US, which also later issued broad authorizations to ensure that government agencies and aid groups can work with Afghan organizations. Now, this comes after desperate calls from the Taliban government and many other countries who warned of a massive human rights catastrophe. Ever since the Taliban took over in August, aid has come down to a trickle due to curbs imposed by the US and its allies. Now, to understand what is happening on ground, let's talk to Prabir more on this. Now, Prabir, if you could tell us, what is the nature of crisis that the Taliban government is facing at this point of time?
See, simply put, Afghan government, before the Taliban take over, had 80% of its budget or essentially all its finances taken care of by foreign aid. Why it is so, we will not go into today. After all, it was facing almost a 20-year long period of occupation and war, in which obviously those who had occupied Afghanistan were also providing the Afghan government with the financial support. Otherwise, it would have collapsed long back. Once the US withdrew with its NATO allies, all that money came to a stop. And once it did, the Afghan government had really no finances, or if it had very little finances to run its apparatus. So right now, forget about the 80% budget that the foreign aid provided. They don't even have enough money to run the daily expenses of the government itself, let alone provide food, buy food from outside, buy, for instance, fuel from outside, all of which are essential to running of the people's lives.
Yes.
Without fuel, without food, how do you run a country? I'm not even talking about paying for hospitals, medicines, and the schools, which are also, all of them are also involved in the current catastrophe that you are talking about. So the issue is simply that this is an economy which, after long periods of war, which has devastated it, is really dependent on foreign aid. And the countries which had invaded have the primary responsibility for seeing that this humanitarian crisis does not proceed in a direction which then destroys the Afghan economy, forcing their people to leave Afghanistan. And Afghanistan is not a small country. It has already produced the second largest number of refugees in the world. This is after Iraq and Syria. And all three have been victims of wars and foreign invasions. And I think that is a central issue. Wars destroys countries. And if those who have actually invaded do not take the responsibility of their invasions, then we have the consequences that is staring us in the face right now. And that is why finally the US and the UN is moving on this count.
So now that the UN Security Council has decided to provide funds to the Afghan government, what is the significance of this move?
See, it's not that the Security Council has decided to provide funds. The Security Council has said funds should be made available.
Okay.
Now, why is it required? Because it's not the UN Security Council's resolutions which are really holding up aid. Because countries can give aid directly if they want to. And they can fund Afghan government if they want to. What stops them is essentially the US sanctions, because US controls the financial system of the world. And therefore, if the US sanctions an entity, it's almost impossible for most financial institutions in the world, as well as the banking system, to provide the funds or make funds available to that entity. What has happened is that the US had sanctioned the Taliban and the Haqqani network in Afghanistan. These are two entities they had put on their various lists. And therefore, any money reaching these entities would be subject to sanctions is only one part of it.
Okay.
All entities providing such funds would also be sanctioned. So you get what is called an infection of sanctions that would take place. If that entity gets sanctioned, all its transactions then come under sanctions or the lens which could lead to sanctions.
Yes.
This is the reason when Iran was sanctioned by the US. All countries which did not agree with the United States still obeyed the sanctions, because not doing so would mean their institutions, their banks, their companies which dealt with Iran would also come under sanctions. So what has happened now is, after the UN Security Council resolution, the US Treasury has loosened some of the elements of sanctions it had imposed in Afghanistan. Now, yes, UN agencies and certain aid agencies, international aid agencies, can give funds to Afghan entities, including perhaps the government entities. We'll have to see how this plays out. And therefore, some funds are now going to be made available for averting the immediate humanitarian crisis that is there. But the long-term solution is really a more stable funding arrangement, which countries can then give funds. And the United States has to recognize that this is not going to work. They cannot control Afghanistan finances in a way and then expect the Afghan government under Taliban, which is the reality today, to really function, just because they do not recognize the Taliban government, and most countries have not. It does not mean, therefore, the normal financial structure of a government is not allowed to take place in Afghanistan. This would be a catastrophe of a dimension not limited to Afghanistan alone. If Afghanistan collapses, all the neighboring countries, including Iran, Pakistan, of course, Central Asian republics, but also its impact would be felt because refugees would not stop in Iran, Pakistan, Central Asian republics. That would also go further. And right now, the largest number of refugees in European Union is Syria, followed by Afghanistan. So Afghan refugees are also a very large number. So I think this is the real risk that the world carries if it does not shore up the essential infrastructure that the government needs to run, and accept the fact that at the moment, whether we like it or we don't, Taliban is the government in Afghanistan, and we have to work with it. We may not like all the things they're doing. We don't like all the things, for instance, Saudi Arabia does. We don't like all the things the United States does externally or internally. But that's not the issue. The issue is it is the only government in Afghanistan now, and I think that's something that we need to take into account.
Our next story is about a referendum that took place in New Caledonia on December 12th to decide on whether the territory in the Southwest Pacific Ocean would gain independence from France. The result was an overwhelming 96.5% against independence. In the aftermath, French President Emmanuel Macron and other leaders hailed the verdict. However, the story is not as simple as it seems, as for the vote took place amid great controversy and a boycott call. We have with us Anish to talk more about on this issue. Now, Anish, where is Caledonia and why does France control it?
That's a good question for a large number of the audience, because it is in the Pacific, as you said. It's quite close to the Cook Islands that New Zealand controls. So France took over this island, annexed it basically in the mid-19th century, and has been controlling it as a colony ever since. So it is more or less in a colonial administrative setup right now, and this is not the only part of the world that France still has a colonial, government. There are other places in the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and several other, even in the immediate neighborhood of New Caledonia. There's French Polynesia and other parts of the Polynesian, Melanesian islands that France still hold a great deal of control over, almost complete administrative control, and not to mention military bases, and even control via other key groups. So this sort of colonialism is something that persist, and France kind of has this thing where it calls these territories as part of France as a whole. The Republic of France, these territories count in its overall geographic area and population. It tries to it even sends some representatives to its National Assembly, and so on. So you have a certain kind of attempt at integration, but not completely, because they are not given autonomy. They are not dealt as normal French citizens, or what are called as departments, which is basically provinces, and you really have nothing in common. Actually, we are talking about an island that is about close to 17,000 kilometers away from actual France in Europe. There is almost nothing in common with with what it has the Aboriginal islanders and also other colonies in the neighborhood. And for them to call it as part of France is like obvious attempt at colonialism. And you actually see that reflected in how even international bodies like the United Nations considers it as, for instance, considered as a non-self-governing uh, uh, territory, which is a term given to the old colonies that European powers used to control, and it is still hasn't gone through a decolonization process that is befitting what we saw, say, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s around the world. We talked about the referendum. One thing that needs to be pointed out, and that you also pointed out, is the boycott. And the boycott itself shows how it brought down voting percentages and turnout to a great deal. We are
Yes.
talking about the lowest. This is not the first referendum, by the way. There have been three others previously since 1988, the last two being 2018 and 2020. So this is the fourth one, and this comes with the lowest turnout ever in a referendum over independence. We're talking about close to 44% or something of that sort. So the rest of the population did not vote, and this comes after the call for boycott by the largest Aboriginal group, political group that has a significant influence in the region.
Considering colonialism is not any longer part of our, you know, geopolitics, and yet France is able to control these territories across the globe, how do you explain that?
It is, in a way, because these are not large colonies. I think the largest they have is French Guiana, which is about 87,000 square kilometers in area. So it's not necessarily the area or even the region that they control, but what comes with it, what the territorial control that comes with the strategic location that it affords France, and more importantly, the exclusive economic zone, which we need to understand is a significant part of France's maritime power. We are talking about the second largest control of exclusive economic zone by a country, and France is not that big of a nation, but it's primarily because it controls these scattered islands across the world, around the world, in different parts of the world, that it has access to an exclusive economic zone that is only second to the United States, which has huge coastlines and territory that is part of its country, like the proper nation we are talking about. France does not have that, but it has these colonies and departments and territories that have anything between complete, proper self-governing government to what New Caledonia has, which is almost just like a partial democratic setup, where the main parts of the government is still controlled by France. And even in this case, so it is this is what France really wants from these places. It really does not want them to be properly independent. And this New Caledonia is not the first territory to actually go through this referendum process. We had previous referendums in French Guiana, which is in Latin America, close to Brazil and Suriname. There was also referendums in Martinique and Guadeloupe. These are islands in the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean. They have also gone through referendums. In all the cases, what we saw is almost complete lack of campaigning, be it for or against independence or autonomy in some of these cases, or and because of that, very small turnout. We are talking about the highest would have been like 55% that Martinique had in 2003, which was on on autonomy. and that was defeated by a very small margin. So in all of these cases, the local population, the native population, really do not have that much space to organize politically. Even though France works as a democracy, we do see significant controls and conditionalities being put for, not to mention a large number of European settlers being part of these populations who also vote. And that is also something that we saw in New Caledonia, where about a quarter of the population, more than a quarter of the population, are Europeans, French, and they're settlers. They have been they are also part of this community of or this vote base we are talking about, that actually participated in the referendum and obviously gave it the landslide. And there are also other settler groups that are not from the immediate region of the Polynesian or the Oceania region, but from Asia, other parts of Asia like Indonesia, maybe some of them are even from North Africa, who are migrants from France or through France, and they are also part of these settler groups that are very pro, or more or less pro French occupation, because they see that as their way of furthering their economic interest in many ways. So this is the sort of colonialism we're looking at, and that really just shows a certain hypocrisy when these same countries go on around other nations being occupying powers or having military occupation in their countries or pretty much in their provinces. So this and this is also at a time when we have China and other nations being targeted by, a certain kind of geopolitical rhetoric of being colonizers of certain countries, when we have an actual case of colonialism happening right in their backyard.
Right now. Yes.
Exactly.
Thank you, Anish, for those details. Now, our final story is about another referendum, this time in Berlin, Germany. In September, the people of the city voted overwhelmingly in support of a proposal to expropriate the property of massive private real estate giants. If the proposal is implemented, it could see over 200,000 houses being taken into public control in a city where there is a massive housing crisis. However, the path is not easy. Franziska Giffey, the new mayor of Berlin, is not very enthusiastic about the proposal, and many have already talked about all kinds of technical issues with it. We earlier talked to Anicia Pekku, who was actively involved in the campaign to get a sense of what are the challenges ahead. She also talks about what this movement plans to do in the coming weeks and months.
I'm not gonna lie, it's difficult what's coming. It was difficult organizing the referendum. It was difficult winning. We were very happy about it, but the work is definitely not over. You are right to say that Franziska Giffey, the newly appointed mayor, is not happy with this referendum, and her party, officially at least, is not happy with this referendum. We are not a political party. We are a people's movement. We did get support from some parties, especially the left parties, the different left parties that we have here. And we have one party in the actual coalition, Die Linke, the left party, which is supporting us officially. And we have a lot of members of the other parties, so the basis of those parties, who think the referendum should be implemented. But the Social Democrats are definitely against it officially. And the Greens say that they would only consider this as a last option. They think there are other things that should be done before. So we're definitely not facing sort of a happy crowd that wants to support us. In terms of next steps, what I can say is that we have to continue pushing. We have to keep applying pressure on the politicians. They're trying now to, I think, take the wind out of our sails, so to say. They're trying to say that now we need to have a commission that needs to check if this is possible, and we need to talk, and we need to plan. And all these things are false, really, because we know that this is possible legally and economically. Otherwise, this wouldn't have been allowed to become a referendum. So it's not a question of if we can do this. It should be a question of how are we going to do this. And so we're trying to apply pressure. They want to organize a commission, for example, that will discuss this. We are not happy with this idea because it's not at all transparent who's going to be in that commission. If you're going to have people who are in the housing market, lobbyists on that commission trying to fight against us, of course, it's not going to be fair or transparent. We've been invited to participate in this commission, and we sort of said yes, but only if you give us 59.1% representation, because that's how we won the referendum, and if it's all transparent and regular meetings and all of that, which we'll see if that happens. And otherwise, we're really trying to move it even more into the direction of grassroots. We want to organize tenants, to provide them with the tools to organize themselves, to identify their needs, and to empower them basically to become even stronger and to apply more pressure from this base level of the population. We're doing a lot of networking. We're trying to also see what other topics we want to discuss and connect with and become allies with, so that we support each other in this fight for an affordable city and for an affordable life. There's a lot of planning to be done. There's a lot of work still to be done, but we're of course very motivated because we won this historic referendum, and so we're gonna keep on going. I know that there's another expropriation movement happening in Hamburg, for example. So there's definitely other cities which are affected by the same kind of problem, and they're trying to do something about it. I don't know about anything at national level at the moment, but maybe we set the precedent. We've been getting a lot of international attention. There's been people from basically all the big cities in the world wanting to talk to us, inviting us over. We did workshops, we went to conferences, we tried to share this knowledge that we have and to share what we've learned and this power that we've achieved, because of course we would like for this to happen in all the cities, and we would like all the cities to be affordable and a good place to live in. And then there's a lot of networking potential in terms of other struggles, as I've already mentioned, where, for example, a big topic for us is voting rights. There have been a lot of people that have not been allowed to vote in this referendum, even though they're very affected, because Berlin has a great population of people with migration background. And so that's unfair, and we're trying to do something about it, and we're trying to apply pressure, and the campaign has done that as well. And we're looking for ways to network and to continue this in the future. I myself am active in the campaign, but mostly active in the group of people with migration background. I myself am such a person. I came to Germany 4 years ago. And we also do a lot of intermediation, between the Germans and us. We are trying to my group is also kind of trying to put together this network of people concerned with ecological movements and climate activism, and to include this topic into the idea of affordable and sustainable housing, so that in the future housing can be green and the city can be greener for everyone. We recently supported Gorillas workers. Gorillas are, it's a delivery service here in Germany, and they had very, very bad working conditions, and we supported their strike, and we talked a lot about how, of course, fair wages and fair rent prices and fair housing are all part of the same big topic about affordable life. So we're recognizing the different kind of dimensions of the housing problem. I've mentioned before this whole migration background discrimination issue, how hard it is for a person that has a migration background, a different sounding name or a different skin color or not perfect German, how much harder it is for those people to find a place here in Germany. So we're trying to fight for that as well. Yeah, it's a recognition of a lot of topics that connect to housing, and we're trying as much as possible to network and to develop the law and the proposal that is going to come in a way that recognizes and addresses all of these different issues.
Well, that's all that we have on Daily Debrief. Do keep following People's Dispatch and come back tomorrow to this show again. Thank you.